Hello, and welcome to another episode of Family Law Lattes. This podcast is for family law professionals in England and Wales looking for straightforward, helpful tips or toolkits to tackle all aspects of family law. Basically, something you can listen to for half an hour whilst you're enjoying your cup of coffee. My name is Melanie Samuel, and today I'm joined by Jeetesh Patel. Jeetesh is a specialist family law solicitor at Laurus Law in London. Jeetesh has over 20 years' experience handling family matters and is an expert in the financial aspects of divorce and separation. He also has considerable expertise in complex international surrogacy and adoption. Today, Jeetesh and I will be discussing the complex topic of international surrogacy. Hello, Jeetesh.
Hi, Melanie.
Jeetesh, you're the second person to be on this podcast, and today it's about international surrogacy.
Oh, I'm very pleased to be on your podcast, Melanie.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm so excited about this. This is an area of law that I know very little about, apart from what you've told me, and it's always so fascinating. How did you get into this type of work, actually? What all of a sudden did you go from dealing with finances and divorce to surrogacy and international surrogacy?
Well, so I'm a family law solicitor, and I've been practicing family law for 20 years. So in my traditional family law practice, I have actually been breaking up families quite regularly. And this area of law I find really rewarding because it's the total opposite. It's actually creating families as opposed to breaking them up as well. So that's how I fell into it. Also, just through friends going through difficulties of conceiving, some of my same-sex couple friends, the difficulties they had about about having children. It was that kind of discussions that I was having with these people that got me into this area of work as well. It is a fascinating area. Well, I find it fascinating because it is constantly changing, and it's changing, or the law is being interpreted by the judges to meet the circumstances of society and the reality of society as well. So that's why I find it very interesting area of law.
Yeah, I remember when we were working together, I remember you telling me about some of the cases where, you know, it was kind of the judge trying really hard to make this work for the families, to make it work so that they could all be together, which is so different from our day-to-day jobs, which is usually, you know, let's try to minimize the fallout of what we're dealing with effectively.
That's right.
That's really cool.
That's right. Yeah. So there are, in particular with the international surrogacy cases, there's only a few high court judges because it's only the High Court can deal with international surrogacy cases. There's only a handful of judges there, and they will always, what we say, read the law so it can fit into everyone's circumstances, basically, to the best of their ability.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
Of course, some rarely don't fall in, but those cases are very, very rare indeed. So, yeah.
Nice. That's always nice to have a pleasant area of what we do.
It is. Yeah.
So what is surrogacy? What exactly is it? What area of law is it?
Mm-hmm. So surrogacy is when a woman carries a baby for somebody else, either because that person has a medical condition, they can't carry the child themselves, or for physical reasons, or if they're in same-sex relationship as well. The intended parents or the parent, because a single person can enter into a surrogacy arrangement now as well, become the legal parent or parents of the child once it is born. So the surrogate is actually just carrying the child for the intended parents. The legislation in the UK is governed by the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act, which is 2008.
Okay. I got a quick question. You said surrogacy arrangements. Now, I thought we didn't have those in England and Wales, but I'm assuming you can have those abroad?
That's right. So I tend to explain to the intended parent or parents that look at the surrogacy arrangement as the plan on you having your baby, that can be set out in what we call a surrogacy agreement, like a contract. Those surrogacy agreements aren't enforceable in the UK,
Oh, right, okay.
but can be enforceable in foreign jurisdictions, and people would need to check with the foreign jurisdiction in which they're entering into the arrangement if the surrogacy agreement is enforceable there or not.
Okay, so definitely if they're having a surrogacy or a surrogate assisting them in this process from, let's say, California or somewhere where it's more mainstream, they might have, well, for example, in California, they have laws about this. So you'd have to say to them, speak to someone out there to find out what you're signing up for.
That's right. So, America, in some states in America, you can get what is called a pre-birth order, which basically says that there is going to be a child that's going to be born through a surrogacy arrangement, but the legal parents of that child, once the child is born, is going to be these intended parents or this intended parent. So,
Okay. So if you have an international surrogacy arrangement, I mean, that's probably not the correct term, but if you have entered into a surrogacy arrangement abroad, and something goes wrong and you want to enforce it in England, I guess you're out the window. You'd need to have to do that in that jurisdiction where it's
that's
happened.
right. You would have to do it in that jurisdiction simply because, from an English law point of view, the child would have to be in the country, i.e., habitually resident in the country, for any proceedings to commence here. So sometimes the English surrogacy arrangements sometimes do go wrong because, as I say, those arrangements, those agreements aren't enforceable. The surrogate could change her mind in England and say, well, actually, I don't want you to have the child anymore. And the commissioning parents would need to make applications to the English courts here.
Okay. Out of curiosity, what are the costs involved? I mean, are there obvious costs, or are they? It really depends on what you've signed up to. How does it work?
So it can be. Well, I found through doing this work, the prices range. I've seen cases where the prices for the entire surrogacy arrangement, excluding the legal side of it when you return back to the UK, people have paid up to £70,000 in some
Oh,
cases.
wow.
There are other cases, such as, for example, in Ukraine, where commercial surrogacy arrangements are legal. So what I mean by commercial surrogacy arrangements is that you can actually pay your surrogate over and above her medical expenses, whereas in England, you can't pay the surrogate other than her medical expenses.
Right.
So the Ukraine offers, because it's commercial, it's business, they offer what are called fixed fee packages and stuff like that. So, or some agencies do anyway. So that can reduce the cost associated with it. But cost is something I always say to people you need to factor in, because there's not just the cost of the surrogacy arrangement, there is a separate cost in coming back into the UK with your child. And then on top of that, a separate cost in obtaining the legal order, the parental order, to secure your relationship with the child in this country.
Okay, we're going to go on to that in a minute, but very quickly. So we've talked about America. You've mentioned Ukraine. What countries have you done this kind of work with, from when you've had children coming back? From what kind of countries?
So I've had children coming back from the States. I've had children coming back from the Ukraine as well. I've had children coming back from Cyprus.
Okay.
Mexico is an up-and-coming one, as the surrogacy world would say. I used to have several cases from India, but then India announced a ban on surrogacy cases for foreign nationals, basically. So.
Okay. And do they each have their own complications or things you have to be aware of when you're dealing with surrogacies from those countries, or is it mostly focusing on what happens when you bring the children back here that you need to be aware of?
I think some of for example, the reason India banned foreign surrogacy arrangements was because it was, and I hate using this, but it was an industry,
Okay.
basically. And it wasn't a regulated
Okay.
industry. So, Ukraine is regulated,
Mm-hmm.
and the states, all of the states, well, certainly the clinics I've dealt with in the states have been regulated, and it's making sure that your agency, the people that you're dealing with on a regular basis,
Mm-hmm.
are actually registered in accordance with the laws of that country.
Okay, that makes sense. All right. So something else for the lawyers to be aware of when they're advising their clients is you need to make sure the country you're liaising with is going to have it as a recognized and regulated process. Right.
That's right.
Okay. So you
Yeah.
mentioned a couple of interesting things. You talked about parental
Mhm.
orders and you talked about bringing the children back into the country. So you've got your clients. They said, okay, we've gone to have a surrogacy arrangement in Ukraine or America, wherever. We've got the baby. The baby's born. What do we do? Or do you say to them, no, you have to start doing things before the baby is born? What do you say?
So I always say, and this is emphasised also by the High Court as well, that before embarking on any surrogacy arrangement, in particular an international surrogacy arrangement, the commissioning parent or parents should first obtain independent specialist legal advice
Okay.
so that they know what they're entering into and what the requirements are going to be before the child is born and after the child is born.
All right. Okay. So definitely have the legal advice. That's always a good thing. Go and speak to someone. And I guess you want to be telling your clients that anyway, because you want them to have everything in place. So they don't need to worry too much about what happens before the child is born. But now the child is born, what do they need to do? What do you need to do for them?
So what I tend to do, the child is born, and the family's first priority is obviously to bring the child home back to
Mm-hmm.
England. So we need to sort out what we call the immigration or the nationality side of getting the child a passport. Now, there's two ways of doing that. Under English law, a woman who gives birth to a child is automatically seen as a child's mother, even though
Okay.
she has no genetic connection. So the surrogate is always going to be the child's mother, even if she has no genetic connection with the child.
Okay. Sure.
If the male commissioning parent has a genetic connection with the child, he can pass on his nationality or his British nationality if he's a British citizen himself. So that child can obtain a British passport. Yeah?
Okay.
In those circumstances, in a nutshell, uh, the consent of the surrogate is required on a form. It's called a form A101A. And also a certified DNA test would be required to confirm the genetic connection between the British father and the child as well.
Okay.
That's it. I'm simplifying it, but in essence, that is what you would need to get. There are cases where the father cannot pass on his nationality for whatever reason. He's not a British citizen himself, or for example, I had a case where he didn't have indefinite leave to remain in the UK,
Okay.
but was living in the UK, but still retained his foreign nationality.
Sure.
So he couldn't pass on his nationality in those circumstances. The government has been very helpful, although their policies are out of date. But there is a policy, and I think it goes back several years, but it is in place that says you can apply for a travel document for the child. So the child wouldn't get a British passport, but would be allowed to come into the country outside the immigration rules, basically. So you're saying you have to prepare a letter and documents in support to say this child was born via a surrogacy arrangement, and in accordance with your policy document, please issue the child the travel document.
Okay. So this is because, has this got anything to do with, for example, you were mentioning that in the States, you can have like a pre-birth document which confirms who the parents of the child are.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to have that, which would say that intended parents are the parents, so the surrogate's name is not on the certificate, would that make it easier to do this process? Or is that totally irrelevant and you still have to go through exactly the same process?
It would make it it's in a way, it is simpler, he says famous last words, if you enter into a surrogacy arrangement in America, simply because the child, because it was born in America, is going to be issued with an American passport.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And with that pre-birth order and and a letter confirming that you're making an application in the UK for the parental order, you can get that temporary entry clearance for the child in the American passport, for the child to come into the country. Once the parental order has been obtained, the child can apply for a British passport in those circumstances.
Okay. All right. So let's say we passed the temporary immigration hurdle and we've managed to get the child into the country. Actually, on a side note, what happens if the father isn't the biological father of the child?
So if the father isn't, so that child is in essence, unless it was born in America, stateless, basically.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
But the government policy, the British government policy, does allow that child to come into the country for the purposes of obtaining the parental order, basically. But you have to demonstrate that you've made the application for the parental order, and you have to demonstrate to the best of your ability that the court is going to grant the parental order as well.
Okay. All right. Okay, so back to what we were talking before. You've got the child into the country through the temporary immigration situation. What do you do next?
So when you're in the country, you have to make an application for a parental order. Some people I have spoken to don't feel that is necessary because there's no way of really tracking it. But, without the parental order, you are not the child's legal parent or parents, basically. Yeah. So the parental order application is made 6 weeks after the child's birth and must be made within 6 months of the child's birth.
That's a small window.
It is a small window. It was very strict once upon a time, but when I was talking about the judges down reading the law, they have allowed certain cases where people have made the application after the 6-month deadline. They've allowed those families to have their parental orders. So it depends on individual circumstances, but the law as it is it's after 6 weeks after the child's birth, but within 6 months of the child's birth, the application for a parental order must be made.
Surely you do need a parental order, because if you have a child where you only have one parent on the birth certificate, the other parent doesn't then have the necessary parental responsibility to make decisions for that child, I'm assuming.
You're absolutely right. The child, in some cases, even if the child entered on a British passport, so it has a British passport, but it has a foreign birth certificate, it would never have a British birth certificate, which you cannot obtain once you've obtained your parental order.
Oh, so they would always... Okay, so unless you have the parental order, you can't change the birth certificate to a British birth or an English birth certificate.
That's right.
Yeah, and I'm assuming parents would... And if you have a parental order, can you change and put the names of the two intended parents on that document?
Yes, so when you make your initial application, there is a section of the form that says what would you like the child to be known as once the parental order is granted? So you could add your surnames onto that.
Okay. And so the process for the parental orders, is it a particularly painless process, or is it multiple hearings and 20 statements and various conferences of counsel to get there?
No, I mean, and I'm not just saying this, provided they've had the initial advice at the beginning and they've listened to that advice and they've got all of their paperwork together, it is an absolutely smooth sailing process.
Okay.
So, there are complicated cases out there where you need to involve counsel and you need to have a number of hearings. Those are rare and far between, and they tend to be those cases where the people haven't had their legal advice at the beginning or thought this is a easy thing for me to do, and it's turned out to be an absolute nightmare for them.
Okay, so they've done the surrogacy and then they've got the child and then they're like, oh, holy moly, how do I get this child back into the country?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, because they haven't factored that in. They've just thought, oh, my child will get a British passport, but then there isn't a genetic connection to allow the British passport. And that's when they get stuck, basically. So, yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. I was having a chat with some French lawyers who were talking about surrogacy from England to France. So French couples coming to England, because in France, surrogacy isn't legal. And there is a whole bunch of complicated things about children born out of surrogacy. And they would come to England, get this child, and then have to smuggle the child back, and literally smuggle the child back through the Eurostar to make sure that they could get the child back into the country. And then when the child was back in the country, the French courts would probably grant an order allowing the child to remain. But then one parent could be the parent, but not the other, ever, because you can't remove the birth mother from the picture effectively. So that was horrifying for the intended parents, obviously, but the only way for them to deal with the surrogacy. All right. So when are there hearings, if ever?
So on what I call the straightforward case, where everything's in order, there are only two, well, from my experience, there are only two hearings. The first is a directions hearing, basically, where the court considers the issues in that particular case that need to be addressed, makes directions, firstly, for the commissioning parents to file a statement in support of their application. That statement needs to deal with the way I do my statements is I deal with each of the factors under Section 54 of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act to grant the parental order, and I exhibit relevant documents in support of that criteria as well. The court at that initial directions hearing also appoint what we call a parental order officer, who is an officer of CAFCAS, basically, to undertake a welfare inquiry. Because the test for a parental order is two-pronged. The first prong is, do you meet each of the criteria for a parental order? And the second, obviously, the welfare test, is it in the child's best interest for a parental order to be granted? So the court at that hearing does tend to allocate a date for the final hearing as well. And the same judge who dealt with the initial hearing would deal with the final hearing, so they retain the case themselves. So at the final hearing, the judge, what I found, I mean, you have to do your standard position statements and your court bundles and all of that sort of stuff. But you tend to find that the judge has read everything by the time you go into court. And you're literally at the final hearing, just sitting there, basically. The judge, just said, I've read everything. Thank you very much, Mr. Patel, blah, blah, blah. And talking to the parents directly. So, and I'm just loitering in the background. So, but it's nice. So to me, it means that we prepared our case properly, obviously.
Sure.
But to the clients or the parents, it means this is their final stage. And it's nice because they bring the child to that final hearing as well. And there is an opportunity, subject to the parents wanting to do this, to have a photograph taken with the judge, where after the judge has delivered the judgment for the parental order. So
Oh, that's nice.
it's lovely. The judges love it because, well, you know, the kinds of other cases
Yeah.
involving children they
Yeah.
are dealing with. Yeah. So, you know, they tend to deal with them first thing in the morning as well, before they go on to their heavier cases, if you like, involving children. So, yeah.
Oh, that's pretty good. How long is
Mm.
the I just love the idea. Sorry, I just love the idea of the judge getting really excited about having their photo
Yeah.
taken
And you
with
see a different personality of that judge, actually,
I
you
bet.
know. So,
I can imagine quite a few judges getting super excited. Do they wear their wigs and gowns or do they just kind of just dress normally?
um, some do, some do. They'll make the effort,
Effort.
basically. Yeah. Uh,
Nice.
so,
And it's the high court, which is,
yeah.
you know, a
Yes,
different kind of
exactly.
court.
Mhm.
That's really lovely. All right, so back to business. How long does the process take?
So the process can vary in time. I'll just give you a time frame. Because it's an international surrogacy arrangement, you have to issue your application at the Central Family Court, who then automatically transfer it to the High Court because of the international element. The delay I found through experience is Central Family Court will issue them straight away.
Yeah.
It's that transfer process that can take time. So as an example, I had a case that started we issued in July, and we had our final hearing in November.
Okay, that's quite some time for parents
Yeah.
that are waiting to have everything
Yes,
finalized.
exactly. But what I tend to do at that first initial hearing is invite the court to grant my clients or client a lives with order, because the
Okay.
court can do that on its own motion without the need for an application. So they've got parental responsibility at that interim hearing anyway. So
Okay. Well, that's good. That provides them with some reassurance.
yeah. Hmm.
Okay. So, yeah, quite a few months. But I guess, in the meantime, they have their child with them and they can, as long as
Absolutely.
nothing bad
Yeah.
happens, or, unfortunate happens,
Hmm.
they're likely to be okay, even if it does take 5 months for the court to process everything.
Yeah. Hmm.
Okay. I think we've covered all the questions I wanted to ask. Oh, no, I did want to ask this. We've talked about international surrogacy. So, obviously, bringing the child back into the country, there are complications, and because it's the immigration aspect. But if you have a child born of a surrogacy arrangement, an informal one in England and Wales, I'm assuming you'd have to obtain a parental order in the same way.
Yes, you would have to. There's none of the immigration requirement, obviously, but you would
Sure.
still have to obtain the parental order. You would
Okay.
still have to meet the criteria for a parental order as well.
Okay. All right.
The sad thing is, in those domestic cases, if the surrogate changes her mind, the commissioning parents, at the very most, might just get a lives with order as opposed to a parental order.
Even if they are the biological parents of that
That's,
child.
yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's quite risky, really.
It is. It is. And plus, as we were saying at the beginning, the agreement, the arrangement isn't enforceable.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So to wrap up, what are your top 5 tips?
So, what would I say? I mean, as I say, and I'm not just saying this, it makes life so much easier for everyone concerned if people first obtained their own legal advice at the beginning, basically.
Mm-hmm.
They did a lot of research into the country they're going to for their surrogacy arrangement,
Sure.
in relation to the clinic as well. Is it regulated? All of those sorts of things. Um, got advice from a solicitor on what they need to do whilst they're there, what they need to do for their immigration application to bring the child home, and what to do when they're back home in the country. I think those, in a nutshell, I don't know if I covered 5 points then, but in a nutshell, would be my top tips. I mean,
so do your homework, do your research, get legal advice in this jurisdiction, but also in the jurisdiction where you're entering into the agreement.
Yeah.
Know in advance what you're getting yourself into and what you're going to have to do to make this smooth sailing.
Absolutely. And I've always found, I always say this to people as well, I suppose it is a tip, is make sure you retain a line of communication with your agency, not necessarily the surrogate, but with the agency, just in case a hiccup arises and you need to obtain some information from them as well.
All right. Okay. That's really good, Jeetesh. Thank you so much for going through that with me. It's such a fascinating area of law, and I've got 101 questions I want to ask about like other things linked to international surrogacy, but that was really very good. I have one final question.
Yeah.
Burning question, in fact. I already know the answer because I've known you for so long, but really, because this is, family law and lattes, what is your favorite coffee?
What is latte? Oh, God. Americano, Melanie.
Oh, obviously.
So, yeah. A black Americano is my
obviously. How many of those have we had over time?
Absolutely. So,
Jeetesh, thank you so much for taking the time to do this with me today.
No, thank you very much for asking me.
It was really helpful, and I'm sure other lawyers are going to find it really helpful. So, yes, thank you very much. And hopefully I'll get you to come and talk about international adoption next. That would be very good.
Yeah, that'd be great as well. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah.
Excellent. All right, Jeetesh, bye.
All right, thanks. Bye.
Family Law and Lattes will continue next week. In the meantime, if you have any suggestions about the podcast or topics you'd like to hear discussed in the future, please send me a tweet at Melanie_Batayar, message me on Instagram at Melanie Batayar, or email me at familylawandlattes@gmail.com.